Role-playing is what makes Dungeons & Dragons more than just another tabletop game. It allows us to craft and discover stories and characters in a way that very few other games can. But for a game of role-playing, it surprisingly only has one rule that encourages it. That rule is inspiration. Sadly, inspiration is not very good at its job. It is often being forgotten or ignored. So today in Dungeon Story Time, we will explore how inspiration works, why it is not great at helping us roleplay, and ways to fix it with some help from the role-playing system, FakeCore. Let's get started. Hello, welcome to Dungeon Story Time, a place where we can learn together how to tell better stories with Dungeons & Dragons. My name is Gerardo, and one of my favorite things about D&D is getting to know my characters and acting like them in the game. I am not a good actor and being self-conscious about my accent. I do not dare make myself harder to understand by trying different voices. So for me, acting or role-playing, it's simply making decisions as my character and constantly putting myself in their shoes. Creating a cohesive identity for our characters is hard work. So it is frustrating when a DM ignores all of that work by never taking it into account. So luckily for us, the inspiration rule makes it all worth it by rewarding the player when they roleplay, right? Let me talk about inspiration for those of you that have not had the privilege of being at a table that uses inspiration. Let me illustrate with an example. Let's say that a DM knows that a character at the table is afraid of the dark, and there is a chance for them to enter a dark cave full of treasure. At the moment, the player has a choice. They can act as their character and ignore the rewards in the cave, or they can ignore role-playing and get the treasure despite their character's fear. If the player controls their love for treasure and lets the character's fear guide their decisions, the DM will reward that player with some inspiration. Later on, the player can use that inspiration to roll with advantage. So now that we have a basic understanding of how inspiration works, let me tell you why it does not fulfill its mission. First, it is temporal. Inspiration do not stack. One cannot be inspired more than once. So there is really no incentive to roleplay in between the times when you acquire that inspiration until you expend it. The second reason is that it depends on some extraordinary dungeon mastering abilities. It is hard for dungeon masters to memorize details about each of the characters at the table to begin with. Keeping them top of mind to reward the players when they lean into those traits, it is really hard. Third, there is no consequence for no role playing. So usually a big enough carrot can drive a player's behavior in a certain way. But in my opinion, inspiration is not that carrot, especially because DMs are often forgetting it. We have lots of negative consequences in the game already. When we roll the dice, there are probabilities, and that driving force is already a big part of D&D. So I'm curious why we didn't give some more teeth to the single rule that we have for role-playing. Luckily for us, we do not have to try to overcome these weaknesses by ourselves. Some of the rules in FakeCore integrate perfectly with inspiration in D&D to make it effective. So let me introduce FakeCore. FakeCore is a role-playing system like D&D, but it's looser and broader. For example, FakeCore has skills, but unlike D&D, they're not predefined. Skills can be anything, and the player usually chooses them during gameplay. To keep this loose and dynamic nature, FakeCore relies heavily on something that it calls aspects. In FakeCore, anything that is can be an aspect. The forest is on fire, the machine is noisy, or the floor is wet are all possible aspects. Generally, we only want to codify gamed realities if they can be used by the DM or the player. But for our purposes, let's constrain the definition a bit more. For us, aspects are the traits that most significantly define our characters. In D&D, we choose backgrounds, ideals, flaws, and bonds during character creation. Those are great sources of inspiration for character aspects. For example, a character's aspect could be a veteran of war, scarred by the many atrocities that she has seen. This makes a very good aspect, not only because it is compelling, but because it can be interpreted as a negative or a positive depending on the situation. Ambiguity creates great aspects. When playing with fake core, you want aspects to always be visible to everyone at the table. So it is very common for these aspects to be written in post-it notes that are always kept in front of all of the players. This makes it much easier for the DM to stay aware without relying in superhuman recall or memory. Making those aspect-like parts of your character sheet more visible to the DM already improves the existing inspiration mechanic. But aspects really shine the most when the DM uses them to complicate things. That is what fake core calls compels. So previously we talked about a character with a fear of the dark. In that example, the player chose to ignore the treasure to respect their character, and they were rewarded by the DM for that bit of role playing. Well, in fake core, the DM does not have to wait for a player to choose to roleplay. If the player is acting out of alignment, the DM can compel a player to take or ignore certain actions. Effectively, the DM can force roleplay. Compels cannot be refused as long as the table agrees that they are fair. But the player can choose to use their inspiration to ignore a compel. If the user cannot or does not refuse the compel from the DM, then the DM will give them inspiration. Even though compels can feel aggressive compared to inspiration, they are a great teaching mechanic for DMs to guide role-playing in new players. In more experienced tables, players might be looking to be compelled so they can gain inspiration. Why not give the same power the DM has to the players? That is exactly what invokes are in fake core. Invokes are a little bit more involved than compels in fake core. So let me try to simplify them in a way that works for D&D. At the table, if a player can describe how an aspect is relevant to a situation, that player is given inspiration. In other words, instead of players waiting for the DM to recognize their role-playing efforts, they can point out how their decisions are being influenced by aspects to gain inspiration. So let's ground this idea with our running example. So our fearful character is going into the cave after all. It is terrified, but it's being encouraged and protected by the party. Suddenly, some goblins appear, ready to attack. The player could then say, I would like to invoke my fear of the dark aspect. Then, the player will proceed to explain why it is relevant. My character is so afraid of the dark that any noise generated by the goblins will have sent him into a mad frenzy, possibly running into some of the goblins. If the DM buys your idea, they will give you inspiration and take your bit of storytelling into account in their scenario. Maybe you completely disrupted the goblins' surprise round, or you managed to knock down some of them to the ground. At that point, dice will be rolled, checks will be made, but the main point is that the player role-played and constructed something new in the story. All of it encouraged by rules alone. The DM or others at the table might also rule that the aspect invoked really does not apply, and inspiration is not given in those instances. But the whole point is that we now have a dynamic that can encourage role-playing effectively for all of the players at the table, including the DM. Fake Core has some wonderful mechanics that I wish we took advantage of more often. And it does not take much effort to enhance D&D without disrupting the core of what makes D&D D&D. In some ways, Aspects, Compels, and Invokes bring D&D closer to its ideal by incorporating mechanics that make role-playing less optional and more relevant in every scenario at play. So that is it for this video. If you are inspired by this mashup, I would love to hear how these ideas played at your table. And if you would like to see more content like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so we do not lose each other in the convoluted interwebs. Thank you for sticking around, and we will see you all in the next video. Goodbye.